Be here now. Just be here now.
Mind rolling, and I'm welcoming Connie Zweig to the show. We're just meeting, just like most of the podcasts you hear me do. And she wrote this wonderful book, The Inner Work of Age, and Shifting from Role to Soul. That might sound familiar to everybody out there. Welcome, Connie.
Hi, Raghu. Thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. I do want to say one thing, which is a little bit of a commercial for the podcast network, Be Here Now Network, and ramdas.org. Not much of one, but just this is a wonderful book that Connie has written, and there is so much useful information. And I have an idea around the first thing I want to mention to everybody. Well, off the bat, this has nothing to do. If you're not over 50, you shouldn't bother with this book, okay? If you're thinking like that, I'm really encouraging and have been all along. Yes, okay, I am part of a generation that is facing this more imminently, the transition, and it makes sense. Yet the older I have gotten, I did delve into this when I was very young. I went to India when I was in my early 20s, so so I had the relationship with the idea of the transition being on multiple levels, not just your physical body dying, which you talk about in the book. So it's, start early. Okay. All of this is relevant, even nothing to do with dying. It's just perspective and the role to soul and all of that. So before you get into it, I just want to say it's really fits with what's in this book and Connie's obvious connection to Ram Dass, that there is a Gita course being presented by Love Serve Remember Foundation, and it's available now to, it's all free, obviously, suggested donation if you can, but if you can't, it is free. And just go to ramdas.org/Gita course, Gita course. It is one of the top, certainly 10 retreats that Ram Dass ever did. And it was the first one at Naropa University in the summer of 1974. It's an amazing thing. We actually have footage of it, video footage, not just audio. So we have kind of both. Yeah, so it's really great. So okay, that's it. That's our sponsor's message from Love Serve Remember Foundation. So where do we stopped about this is not just, okay, if you're getting close, you need to read this book, right? Or that's just not true. Am I right or wrong?
Well, we're aging from the moment we're born. We're incarnated into an aging body, right? So age is not only about later life. Different stages of life carry different tasks, different developmental tasks, and different meanings and purposes for us. I just had a 30-year-old friend tell me that he read my book, and it's changed forever how he's going to think about his life and how he's going to age. And one of the really interesting, kind of compelling reasons that I wrote this, Raghu, is that I found the research of Becca Levy at Yale, a psychologist at Yale, who has spent her whole career examining how unconscious images, attitudes, and beliefs about aging affect us throughout the lifespan. So in childhood, when we're internalizing ageist attitudes, it's going to shape how we age at every stage of our lives. So you're exactly right. This is not only about people beyond midlife. It's really, really important for all of us to understand how our inner, I call it the inner ageist, how the part of us that's either denying aging or carrying negative messages about it is really shaping our experience. And that happens from the beginning. We take the body, we start to age.
You're just prompting me in my memory about something, about the reality of which we are ageists. I mean, it's amazing how many things we are, or at least the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Because I had a teacher once, and we went on a trip to a seminar over the weekend, and then she was dropping me off at a hotel, motel, for the night. And she knew that I had this bullshit going on about aging people, and she dropped me off at a facility that was for seniors, basically. Right? I had no idea. She checked me in and says, "See ya."
What a wise person. Now.
And the trip that was going on in my head, I mean, just phenomenal. And right. All the way to, actually, even before that, when I had gotten to India, I got to have darshan of Mother, who's this great saint who lived with one of the great philosopher sages in India, Sri Aurobindo.
Yes.
And I actually got to be with her, but she was in a moment, very old at the time, over 90, and maybe had Parkinson's or something and lost motor control. And I'd heard all this stuff, and I was like going in there like, I didn't want to get caught in that because I knew how easily that story was embedded in me, and there was absolutely nothing that was going to move me in the moment except something like this, which was walking in the room. It was full of light, which is, the kind of woohoo books you read about. You walked in, there was light. Well, there was. I don't know what to say. I can't say it was light, but it was light. And then she, I had this wonderful encounter with her that was deep beyond anything that I had, before. It was a before and it was an after in terms of being with a holy person, basically.
Yes.
So, not that Ram Dass wasn't holy, but this person was in another, shall we, so much further down the line, perhaps, in that moment. And it obliterated this whole ageist thing that I had going on because I was taken right into beyond the bodies, not hers, not mine. I didn't see anything. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And that is part of, again, I want to keep reinforcing the fact that these concepts and the perspective that Connie brings to them and the wisdom and insight is useful for everyone now. This is not for old people, although...
No, that's right. It's about age is our curriculum. It's all grist for the mill, as R.D. always said, right? So if the grist that we're experiencing is about aging, this is how to use it to cultivate consciousness. If the grist is not about aging, there are lots of practices in here that you can use in general for your psychological work, for your emotional development. But the point for me was that I was in my late 60s. I'd been doing sitting practices for 50 years. I'd been a depth psychologist for 30 years. And I began to feel disoriented. And I was really surprised that that would happen to me. And as I started interviewing people and recognizing that there was a late life identity crisis that really hadn't been identified, I started to see these connections between spiritual practice and stage of life, and how I could guide people. I'm known as the shadow expert from meeting the shadow and romancing the shadow. So how I could help people uncover the unconscious shadows that they were carrying about age and move more deeply into spiritual practice and have this shift in identity that Ram Dass called role to soul. So that's how I oriented the book. And it reoriented me.
I bet. Yeah, there's so much really useful here, information around the shadow. So yeah, shadow awareness is one let me just read something actually from it, if you don't mind. When we learn how to establish a conscious relationship with those parts of ourselves that are outside of awareness, we can attune to our many inner voices and detect which can be guides for us now and which can sabotage our dreams. We can learn to slow down, turn within with curiosity. I like that. With curiosity and open to what's calling to us without dismissing it and without being taken over by it. That's what I call romancing the shadow. And I think you need to trademark that, Connie, and it'll be the next big movie, a rom-com.
When we published Romancing the Shadow, somebody actually auctioned the rights for it.
Oh, really?
But no, it's Hollywood, never happened.
Yeah, right.
But let's be with that for a minute, because, in most spiritual communities, as you know, there's very little talk of the shadow. And there's very little understanding. I mean, in Ken Wilber's integral world, it's included. But in most Eastern cultures that are not psychological, that come from different kinds of roots and lineages, it's not included. But for me, my two lineages have been depth psychology and Vedanta.
Mm.
I mean, you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita. It's like my Bible.
Mm.
So how do we bring these worlds together? I mean, that's really what my mission has been. And for me, if we do spiritual practice and we focus on transcendence and moving beyond ego, but we don't actually process our emotional material, especially our unconscious material, could be from birth, could be from childhood, could be from later experiences, then we see what happens, Raghu. We see all these spiritual teachers who act out their shadows over and over. The 1980s was full of that, right? So I've been trying to kind of build this bridge between these worlds and really follow Ram Dass's teaching that this is grist for the mill. This is not to be avoided. So let's say something about the shadows of age. So if we live in a culture in which young is good and old is bad, strong is good and weak is bad, right? Quick is good and slow is bad. Independent is good and dependent is bad. And all of a sudden we wake up and we have all those traits. What happens? All of those traits have been dormant in the shadow, in the unconscious, because they've been unacceptable. They've been forbidden. They've been denied. But then all of a sudden, here they are, or gradually, these traits emerge. I'm slower, or I feel weaker, or I feel dependent. And people freak out, regardless of how much spiritual practice they've done, because this material is emerging from the shadow. So we can go back and we can meditate and we can center ourselves and we can silence our minds, right? But at the same time, that's not going to process these unconscious fears and beliefs that we've internalized from the culture. So I really tried to work in the book to build this bridge between shadow work and spiritual practice. And partly because that's what I've lived, it comes really directly out of my own practice, out of my own life. And it's what I worked with during my clinical practice for so long. I'm retired from that now, but that was really, every time I taught shadow work, I taught meditation.
Yeah.
Because you can't really face your shadow unless you have a way to return to loving awareness and sit in it and find the refuge in loving awareness, right? And then when the shadow material comes, you're more grounded.
I don't even think it's about a bridge. I mean, I'm being a little bit cutesy, but the reality is it's one. To me, it's just there's only one thing going on. If the aspects of the shadow do not get attended to, and if we continue on, everybody knows the spiritual bypass thing.
Yes.
If we continue on that path, it just continues to be very difficult, because then getting into that center that is beyond judgment, and all of, particularly, if we can't move from that place, which is so much freer and so much more spacious, if we can't move into Ram Dass's loving awareness, or if our mind is still come with it down, that's another spiritual bypass. We're just using it in the way that's most convenient to continue with the defense mechanisms and the passive aggressiveness and all of those things, those shadows. So it has to be one.
That's right. They have to be really interconnected, or either one of them precludes the other one, and we split. We have in psychology this word that we're splitting. So we don't want to split our psychological and spiritual work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, I love this thing in the book. I love Robert Bly and his translations and his wonderful work.
Yes.
I don't know if it's a little book on the human shadow.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever seen that, but I love how you quoted him. When we are young, we carry behind us an invisible bag into which we stuff any feelings, thoughts, or behaviors that bring disapproval or loss of love, anger, tears, neediness, laziness. By the time we go to school, our bags are already a mile long. Mine was 10 miles long, okay? Oh, in high school, our peer groups pressure us to stuff the bags with even more individuality, sexuality, spontaneity, different opinions. We spend our life until we're 20 deciding which parts of ourselves to put in the bag. It's great. And we spend the rest of our lives trying to get them out again.
That's right.
Oh, that's
and
really
then
good.
Trying to transcend them.
Yeah, and transform at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Robert, we lost him a couple months ago, and he was really as kind of ornery and eccentric as he was a brilliant poet and translator and gift to the world. And so we're losing a lot of folks in our generation, in the boomer generation and the silent generation. People are moving on, becoming ancestors now. But, one of the things that I noticed and that motivated me to write again, because I really didn't think I was going to write another book. This is my 6th book. Was that there's no rite of passage in our culture to become an elder. There's no ritual. There's no acknowledgement. We become a senior on our Medicare birthday. But what does that really mean? Because many people, I think there are 10,000 people turning 65 every day now in our generation.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And what does that mean? Because many folks, I don't want to say most, but many folks grow depressed. They feel isolated. They feel, separation from others. They feel, and some people get very rigid and regretful, And so is that an elder? So for me, elder is a stage, not an age. It's a level of consciousness. And we can have many levels of consciousness within elderhood, but it's a stage rather than an age. And so I realized that there were certain developmental tasks that we needed to go through to become elders that are not taught anywhere in our culture. And so my hope is that the book takes people kind of step by step through this process, and then toward becoming a spiritual elder. For those who are interested in doing practices and finding the practice that's right for who they are now, that really fits who they are now after a long life experience. And, that's not for everybody, right? That's not for everybody. It's not for everybody to, disidentify with the body or with the story. But some people are ready to. Some people are ready to recognize who they really are and live from that level of consciousness. So for me, and I've been hearing from clinicians who are using the books with older adult patients that it does work like that. It does help people kind of to step by step go through cleaning up their emotional business, their unfinished business, cleaning up their spiritual unfinished business, how to do a life review, including from the shadow material. All of these tools so that when you actually finish the book and you've found your spiritual practice, you're at a different stage of life. You're emerging as an elder. And that's really my hope and my wish for this book, which will be my last book. Official announcement.
That's an interesting subject. We're actually in these days thinking about it because the retreats we're holding have people, for the most part, people who have naturally
70s.
Gone. Yeah, they're of course old, 60s, 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, even 80s, even 80s. My God. It's looking towards mentoring as an obvious option because there's a need.
Yes.
There is a need, and more especially, of course, what we're going through these days. And so I think that it is happening naturally, and I'm happy about that in our own lineage, so to speak. It's a little actually more difficult than in Buddhist lineage, the Bhakti lineage, meaning, because there's much less of a way for the intellect to grab on to something.
That's so true.
Which is the beauty of it, which is why all the retreats that we do have, Ram Dass had all of our Buddhist friends from Jack Kornfield on.
Yeah.
And so, this is highly important, and I am totally in sync with you. I know plenty of people who are in my age group who my son is more mature and more has a perspective that is way more spacious, shall we say?
Yes.
Here's something good to elaborate on. I think you talk about the feelings and capacities that were rejected by the ego and exiled into the shadow contain the hidden treasures of late life. If the ego strives for strong, then weak goes into the shadow. If the ego strives for progress, then a decline goes into the shadow, et cetera, et cetera. You mentioned it a little bit in terms of it's all about speed,
Yes.
And in fact, as far as the general population is concerned, it's a nuisance that you got to get them over to the nursing home. That's the biggest thing that most people, and you got to then attend to it, and then you got to worry about it, and you got to get emotionally distraught about it. But, providing something of wisdom, that never gets thought out, never. So anyhow, what you say is when one of those bad traits from the shadow manifests in late life, the inner critic can get loud. And that's where all this judgmental stuff, which is, harks back to the efficacy of finding any practice that gets you behind you thinking you are any of those things.
Yes.
And I like what you say here and this is what I'd love to investigate a little bit, when we can romance it or coax it out into an awareness like a coy lover, it will tend to recede back behind the curtain. With patience, we can invite it into the light. Very important. Maybe just flesh that out, Connie.
So, to Ram Dass's community, I can say more explicitly, this is about witnessing. I mean, you mentioned spaciousness. This is about cultivating the space or the witness from the noise in the mind. I didn't use that term in the book because it's not really well known. But when we can witness the self-talk, whether it's a critic, I had many older female clients who were experiencing self-hate as their bodies changed. As they got wrinkles or a little heavy around the middle, a lot of horrors, to the ego. That was like the worst nightmare that their egos could stand. And with men, I found dependency carried a lot of charge. So what we're saying there is, what I was saying in the piece that you read is, when these feelings and fears are unconscious, they hold a lot of charge. When we begin to let them out of the box and witness them little by little, they begin to lose their charge. And the more that we can do that, the more liberated we become from them, so that we're no longer so overshadowed that we're identifying with that voice. I call it a shadow character. So people identify it. They identify what they're saying to themselves, what they're feeling, what's going on in the body. Then they give it a name. So say the inner ageist, we mentioned that. So you recognize that the inner ageist is feeling shame about how you look. And you start to work with that. You can dialogue with it. You make it conscious in many ways. Some people draw it. Some people write letters to it. And as you make it more conscious, the shadow character in relation to age, then what happens is it loses its charge and it doesn't become so controlling of your psyche. And then it becomes easier to witness it. I wanted to mention, because you mentioned bhakti, I interviewed Krishna Das in the book. I interviewed a whole bunch of spiritual teachers. I actually feel so privileged that I was able to talk to Father Thomas Keating right before he died. Yeah, right before he left. Rabbi Rami, Ken Wilber, lots of teachers. But, Krishna Das said a funny thing to me. He said, I sent the invitation. I wanted him to talk about his own experience of aging. And first he said, I have to check it out with Maharaji. So he went for a walk without telling me. He said, I'll get back to you. He went for a walk. And a couple days later, he emailed and he said, I walked by a bookstore and Meeting the Shadow, your book, was in the window. So I knew I should talk to you. Mm-hmm. So this is a kind of a, orientation to bhakti that is different from other traditions. And that has this tremendous beauty of love. And in some ways, like you said, easier to transcend the mind, because it's not about identifying with thoughts and stories and beliefs, right? And then there are these other people who I interviewed who were all about their beliefs, right? And all about sort of the mental plane. Yeah. And the development of their beliefs, the development of their thinking, So I just want to say, the reason I'm talking about this is that the book is not written based on your beliefs. I was very intentional about not making it dogmatic. Like, if you don't believe in life after death, then don't bother with this book. It's not about that. It's not about metaphysics. It's not about what you believe or don't believe. It's about the internal experience of aging from the inside out, the psychological and spiritual challenges and possibilities for this time of life.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, the core for me is the practicality. You're talking about this is not about beliefs. This is about practicality. This is about just looking and seeing what perspective you're coming from, looking at the deepest, darkest shadows, looking at the habitual patterns and the neurotic tendencies. I mean, and that has to be rolled into the idea that practice will help move you into what Ram Dass calls loving awareness center of the chest, soul, Buddha mind, whatever. They're all the
they're all the same. So let's talk about the shift from role to soul.
Okay.
Because, you know, some of our listeners may be very familiar with that, and others may not have heard of it for 20 years. I mean, Ram Dass was talking about it a long time ago. Mm-hmm. So as I was writing, that phrase came to me like an echo from the past. I mean, the halls of decades, you know. And I realized that was what I was writing about. That I was writing about the shift from what we do to who we are. And that our identification with what we do, our roles, I call the doer, the shadow character of the doer. And what happens in our culture, which is so emphasizes doing and success and achievement and productivity, what happens when that slows down? Or you're forced into retirement, or your family roles change and your kids are gone, or whatever circumstance changes, and that role that you've identified with is done. People tend to have a lot of identity crisis during those times, right? Mm-hmm. So this shift from role to soul is about recognizing, you know, the universal recognition that we are that. We are spirit. We are soul. We are loving awareness. We are Buddha nature. We are not what we do. And what we do comes and goes. And it changes through the lifespan. And it changes through lifetimes. But it's not who we are. And so for me, you know, Ram Dass said it all in those 3 words, role to soul. And that's really what I want, what I'm hoping that readers will focus on, which is how to explore that internal spiritual shift in their own world, in their own inner world. And it's not easy. You know, most of us are compulsive doers, right? And we feel good if we were productive at the end of the day, you know, and we go to a party and someone says, what do you do? That's the first thing people say. So it's not easy. But it's our task. That is the spiritual task from my point of view.
Yeah. Well, it's not even a task. If you want to continue being unhappy, uptight, worried, and full of anxiety, then don't attend to this. I'm being really crude, but really, it is. It's a self-generated task. I mean, it's what happened. I was just so miserable, and when I was a teenager up until when I was 20 or something.
Yeah.
I mean, I was wide open and ready. And when the thing came, I jumped on it. And I jumped on it because I was tired of being the mess that I was.
So maybe calling is better than task.
Calling.
You know, you hear the call or you feel the yearning for something more.
Yeah.
Listen to it. That's a really important, valuable feeling or voice or sensation.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's amazing how when that perspective shifts by virtue of doing some practice and being with people who have the same thing in mind, is to get free of this stuff, things really do shift. And that perspective is suddenly from a much more elevated place where things are seen more clearly, motivations most especially.
Yes.
Which is a thing that traps us immensely. So here's another thing from the book that again points to it's not for old people, okay? And it's what you were talking about before, which is including shadow work with meditation. You can't deal with it unless you are moving into a place through, and meditation can be chanting. It's getting behind the mind so that there's more spaciousness and you're not following and believing the thoughts, willy-nilly.
Right.
And so once that happens, then the self-interested motivations and the subconscious shadows and so on are just you can be way more friendly with them and kind of invite them in and hang out, rather than pushing away and running the other way.
That's right.
If you say here, if we are to allow into conscious awareness that which we most fear and dread, such as dependency, degeneration, and death, those are the big three right there. We need to be grounded in something larger than our personality, something beyond ego, which lies within each of us. So start doing that as soon as you realize you got fooled when they gave you a name and everything, and you just identified that way and did everything that was you're supposed to do. And once you realize that, like Adyashanti, you know Adyashanti,
Mm-hmm.
He realized that when he was like 6 or something. And how he realized it, he said, I don't understand why all these adults all around me are acting out in the most obnoxious ways, angry and shouting and drinking, whatever. And then around, I think it's true, around 10, 11, 12 years old, something happened that just kicked him into the realization,
Mm-hmm.
I know what's going on with these people.
Mm-hmm.
They believe their thoughts.
That's right.
That's what he said. And then he wanted to find out what thoughts were, and he went into meditation. And and the rest is history. He's a wonderful teacher.
Right.
So pure awareness, the portal to silent vastness, and that's got to be in terms of practice. Talk a little bit about that, And I know you included from my turn from doing to being, and that's a big part of that.
Well, it's really what we have been talking about. There are these 3 portals that I suggest are really needed to become an elder. And one is shadow awareness. So we're connected to the psyche, and we start to uncover what's repressed in the shadow. And that way we're not going to act it out self-destructively or destructive of others. We connect to mortality awareness so that we're not in denial.
I love that, by the way, mortality awareness.
Right. So we're not in denial. Yes, that's right.
Right?
That's right.
Is on your left
I had
shoulder.
a Don Juan experience. I can tell you. I haven't said this in any other interview, but, I was working with a satsang, and these were people I had gotten to know. And each time I opened my mouth, somebody said, that's a concept. That's a concept. And this went on for, I don't know, half an hour. That's a concept. No matter what I said, that's a concept. And my mind stopped and it fell onto the floor. All the contents of consciousness emptied out onto the floor. And it was a Don Juan, where he talked about the world stopping. That was how he described the shift in consciousness. And that's what happened. And I sat there with this hollow head and recognized instantly that I'm not my thoughts. I mean, my thoughts are sitting on the floor and I'm still here.
Yeah.
Right? So I am not my thoughts. So mortality awareness and pure awareness. So pure awareness or loving awareness, or whatever we call it, transcendence or emptiness, whatever we call it, that there's some connection to this transpersonal, non-dual, universal center that's in all of us, this center of consciousness that's within us. And for me, those are the three portals to becoming an elder. And I've met many people now over the last, I would say, 2 decades who live in very high levels of consciousness, who are ordinary people, who live full-time in non-duality, who don't experience, separation, whether it's in space-time or body-mind, or, who have really attained high degrees of consciousness. And it's been very inspiring for me to recognize, because I've been sitting for so long and I have my own experiences, but they're not, they're states. They're not levels that remain for me. Whereas my husband is in this very permanent, completely expanded, non-dual reality. And so are some of my friends. So I'm telling you that because this is not a pipe dream. This is not wistful thinking. This is not, 1960s, let's go back and drop acid because that's the only way, there's no other option at this. Because a lot of people are feeling that now. I really am so grateful that I know these people for whom the promise of spiritual practice has materialized. And it's really quite wonderful. And I saw some of that with Ram Dass, when I was up close to him. I saw him become more radiant. And I don't know, his internal subjective reality, but I certainly did see expansion and radiance grow in him. And egolessness, that there was less and less ego's agenda.
I don't know. Did you see him in Maui after he moved there and everything? That's when his consciousness certainly turned completely into what can I do for you, not what you can do for me. So there's in terms of, by the way, role to soul, and the whole identity thing. I don't know if you've seen Becoming Nobody, the film that was done a couple of years ago.
Oh, yes, I did.
Yeah. So that has all of that whole arc all the way to him talking about death and dying.
Yes, right.
And within it, though, my favorite thing is, when is it enough of what I need? When is it enough of what I want? It's much more interesting to serve people. And that's what happened to him. And in that term, to me, that's right on. I mean, maybe, as you said, who knows the internal consciousness of a being, and how much there was the absence of objectivity from me to you. But I know there was a lot that had gotten wiped free for him. So, he certainly stands as an example of that. There was one thing here that really got me.
Okay.
Trust has in it the seed of betrayal. That's how I took it, by the way. I was like, ooh, scary. Because I am a big proponent of trust. I trusted Ram Dass when I first second I met him, because of his ability to. There was no Richard Alpert, there was no Ram Dass. There was just, what is it that you need, and I will be there, and it won't be me. But I didn't know it then. But Maharaj Neem Karoli Baba, it was, he was allowing that to, just using Ram Dass was just a nice tool. No, what did Ram Dass used to call? I'm the worm on the fishing line. That's what he said. That's so great.
Well, you know,
so
Hillman,
trust
yes.
got me, you know, and that's really important. For me, if you can, everyone has ineffable experiences of some sort through. It could be through entheogens, it could be through music, it could be whatever. And the point being that trusting that opens up an entire world. Discrimination, spiritual discrimination, has to be there with this trust, and that's to me the a little bit of the dichotomy, right? But trust in it, the seed of betrayal. What are we talking about here?
So what we're talking about is James Hillman, who lived in duality and was exploring psychological dynamics and basically saying that any, one-sided feeling contains its opposite. So, and if we don't, so if I trust you and you act out in a way that's harmful to me, I shouldn't be surprised because I know you have a shadow.
Correct.
So that's what he was saying. And I think what is important is not that it won't hurt me. It's not that it wouldn't disappoint me or even break my heart. But it's that at this point, I'm not going to be that surprised because I'm no longer naive about about the darkness of human beings, as we see on the world stage now. So I think that that section on emotional repair and healing and betrayal doesn't have the larger spiritual framework. It's a psychological section.
I got it.
Yeah.
I got it. Now
and
I understand.
So by trust, he means blind trust.
Right.
Right.
Well, let's see. What I would say, well, I'll use Ram Dass because he's the most well-known example. He's a great example. I would say that my intuition played a big role in the kind of trust that I had with Ram Dass, where there was no possibility of that trust being broken because it was beyond his personality. And so I guess that is the spiritual element. I was very fortunate. That's who I ran into when I was searching, and I was very fortunate. I mean, good karma in that respect.
Yeah.
Now, if I trusted a friend that, as you said, was, the shadows were still there, the subject-object stuff was still there, I would have not gotten bent out of shape had that trust, being abused in some way.
Right.
So so again, that's intuition. There, I think we do know when. Look, people get fooled all the time. It's a very difficult thing.
Yeah, it's very
trust.
Tricky.
Yeah,
it's very tricky. And it's difficult because projection is unconscious. So when we project onto someone that they're good or that they're evolved or that they're enlightened, a whole dynamic gets constellated with that projection.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other conversation.
Muddy river, muddy water there.
That's a whole conversation to have, yeah.
Well, it's actually, I think that the pursuit in particular, for me, of just connecting with a wisdom that I trust, it's the Tibetans, and it always has been. And I think that's really helped in terms of what I mentioned before, discriminating wisdom, which is absolutely necessary.
Yes, that's right.
And the best way of getting there is really opening oneself up not to any particular. I mean, I love the Tibetans. There's people everywhere that you can bump into that is a teacher you could trust, that at the beginning can lead you into the right discrimination. And discriminating wisdom is extremely important. So,
and there are Tibetan teachers who've acted out their shadows in horrific ways.
yeah, really.
I
Yeah.
won't name names.
Yes, yeah. But
yeah,
count on the universe does take care. There is, everyone has that which is a bad term because it's abused, which is guru, which is just use guide. There is something that the universe connects into your very core of your being, which you can, through intuition, learn to trust, even without a manifestation. But normally, if one is opening up a manifestation, there's so many of them, Christ and Buddha, doesn't, or it's more like a Neem Karoli Baba, which is a local thing that happened in the last 50, 60 years. So, yeah, trust and intuition and a little sprinkling of discriminating wisdom, and all will be well.
In Vedanta, there's a whole path of discrimination. It's a yogic path.
Yeah.
That teaches
Viveka, right? Viveka.
It teaches you to say, not this, not that, not this, not that, and what you're basically doing, right? You're basically discriminating between the relative and the absolute.
Yeah. Between,
this and that consciousness. Yeah. So it's really important to be discriminating in the spiritual world.
I don't know Ken Wilber. I know of Ken for a long time, right? Ken has been teaching. But there's a couple of things in here I like. He told you contemplative practice is so important in late life because now we need to let go and detach from limited identities and self-images to continue to evolve. We continue to have experiences, but learn to witness this and let go, witness that and let go. Again, to me, this is important for a 21-year-old, okay, to get into contemplative practice and learn how to detach from the roles and identities. I mean, get a head start on it is what I think, right?
There's mixed press about that, Raghu, because in the world of psychology, we believe that we need egos to go through the world, that we need to develop a healthy ego to function in society, to build the foundation for a life, if we're not going to live a monastic life, to build a foundation, and that we have to be somebody before we can become nobody. So there's that argument. There's the other argument that, more like the ego's the enemy and we should kind of transcend it as soon as we can. So I think there's kind of individual assessment about this. I certainly had people in my clinical practice who didn't really develop kind of consolidated egos and had a very hard time in the world as a result of that. And I met a man a number of years ago who I came to know very, very well, who never really developed an ego, a really high being. I mean, maybe the highest being I've ever met, because I spoke to him every week and heard the internal experience that was unfolding in him. So I knew about it. And he said he had 15 minutes of ignorance in his whole life, and it was hell. He couldn't believe that's how other people live. But after all of this intimate friendship, he acted out his shadow with my husband and me. So what does that tell us about the need for ego and psychological development? My sense is that the way that I came to understand this was that because he didn't really have psychological development, he also didn't have moral development. Which is part of the relative, right? It's part of relative, you know. And so even though, I mean, I am certain that his attainment is magnificent, he didn't really have emotional and moral development in the way that I expected him to. And most people I know have cultivated that. And so it's very tricky to say 20-year-olds should transcend their ego. I don't know.
I don't know. I'm not saying transcend ego. That's a whole, that's like saying they should get enlightened at 21. They should do the practice which allows the witness to take place so that they do see they are not their identities, they are not their roles, they are not their thoughts, so that there's a beginning to the practice of becoming nobody. Yes, there has to be one would hope in one's early 20s that one's ego is well developed, of course. But this isn't about going for the brass ring. This is just about how can we be a little bit more clear in our
spacious inside.
Yeah, and how we can really see the way in which we get caught and what gives us suffering and grasping and all of that stuff. Yeah,
gotcha.
Well, this is a conversation that could go on for a few days, right?
It's good. Let's go get our sleeping bags.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff. Really, really. Connie, thanks for writing this.
Thank you so much. I love talking with you.
And you have, of course, music is everything to me, and center in your book is Leonard Cohen.
Yes.
Okay. Leonard, he comes from Montreal. He was my hero when I was a kid. And then you quote him as he's saying to us, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Talk about, that's just incredible. It's okay to be human on one level, and then know that, this is my own interpretation of Leonard's words, but know that the universe is providing a way to transform. And that goes to Ram Dass talking about suffering brings me closer to God, which is one of the hardest concepts. So next time we talk, Connie, we'll talk about that.
That sounds great. It's a plan.
So everybody, you go to Mindrolling and BeHereNowNetwork.com. Go to the landing page on BeHereNowNetwork.com/Mindrolling. And links to Connie's book, which will be here shortly. Actually, probably be here just when this comes out in March, right?
No, the book is out.
Oh, it's already out? Oh,
yeah,
okay.
In fact, may I say one more thing?
Yeah.
The book is out. People who've been reading it have been reaching out to me asking for how to follow up.
Yeah.
And so they're forming wisdom circles now to read the book and do the practices in the book together.
Really? That's cool.
In community. So there are about 30 circles now of people aging in community. And if you're interested in that, you can email me, ConnieZweig@gmail.com. Put wisdom circle in the subject line so that I catch it. And I will connect you with other people who are reading the book.
Okay. And we'll have that in the show notes, and which is where the link to get the book will be as well. And again, this is Mindrolling on Be Here Now Network. Go to BeHereNowNetwork.com. Don't forget about the Gita course, which is ramdass.org/Gita course, and sign up. That's a wonderful talk about practice. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, Connie.
Thank you. Much love.
Much love.